When the lawyer finished reading the will, the room erupted in cruel laughter. The snobby relatives inherited millions, while Rachel was handed the keys to a crumbling, junk-filled house. They called her the family fool, but the laughter died the day she tore down a false wall in the basement. The mahogany-paneled office of Simon Fletcher, attorney at law, smelled of expensive scotch and impending greed. The rain battered against the high windows of the Chicago high-rise, but inside, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Arthur Harrington was dead. The patriarch of the Harrington shipping empire had finally succumbed to a long battle with illness at the age of 89, leaving behind a staggering fortune, a portfolio of lucrative real estate, and a family that had been circling like vultures for the better part of a decade. Rachel sat in the corner of the room, her damp coat pulled tightly around her shoulders. She was the anomaly in the room, the niece who had actually spent time with Arthur, not because of his bank accounts, but because she genuinely loved the eccentric, gruff old man. Across from her sat her Aunt Beatrice, draped in mourning clothes that looked suspiciously like a Parisian runway collection, and her cousin Gregory, who was already discreetly scrolling through listings for yachts on his phone. Uncle Richard tapped his silver-tipped cane impatiently against the Persian rug. Simon Fletcher cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. "We come now to the division of the primary assets," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of a judge. The next 20 minutes were a blur of unimaginable wealth being casually tossed across the table. Beatrice received the Hamptons estate and the majority of the liquid assets. Richard was granted control of the shipping company's board and the penthouse in Manhattan. Gregory was handed a trust fund that would ensure neither he nor his future grandchildren would ever have to work a day in their lives. And finally, Simon said, pausing and looking down at the parchment with a slight frown, "To my dearest niece Rachel, who alone understood the value of history, I leave the property at 42 Willow Creek Drive, Pennsylvania, and all its contents." A pin drop could have been heard in the room, followed almost immediately by a sharp, ungraceful snort from Gregory. "Willow Creek?" Beatrice gasped, pressing a manicured hand to her chest in mock horror before breaking into a wide, malicious grin. "You mean the hoarder house. He left her the junk pit." The room erupted into laughter. Even Simon Fletcher looked mildly apologetic. The Willow Creek house was an infamous family legend. It was a decaying Victorian mansion that Arthur had purchased 30 years ago. He never lived in it. Instead, he used it as a dumping ground. Whenever Arthur's eccentric obsession with estate sales, flea markets, and bankrupt antique stores flared up, the treasures were shipped directly to Willow Creek. The family had long considered it the tragic symptom of an aging minder monument to Arthur's perceived senility. "Well, Rachel," Richard chuckled, leaning heavily on his cane, "I suppose you can open a museum for broken toasters and moth-eaten rugs. If you need a loan for a dumpster, do let my assistant know." Rachel kept her chin high, though her face burned with humiliation. "Thank you, Uncle Richard. I'll manage." 2 weeks later, Rachel stood on the overgrown lawn of 42 Willow Creek Drive. The house looked like a rotten tooth jutting out of the Pennsylvania landscape. The paint was peeling in long gray strips. The porch sagged under the weight of decades of neglect, and the windows were caked in a thick layer of grime. Unlocking the heavy oak door, she was immediately hit by the suffocating smell of mildew, old paper, and stale air. The sight inside was overwhelming. There was barely a path to walk. Floor-to-ceiling stacks of yellowing newspapers formed precarious canyons in the hallway. The living room was a graveyard of broken grandfather clocks, bizarre taxidermy animals with missing glass eyes, rusted bird cages, and boxes upon boxes of tangled wires, old typewriters, and rusted iron tools. It wasn't just messy, it was a labyrinth of garbage. For the first month, Rachel worked relentlessly. She hired a local appraiser, a weary man named Benjamin Hayes, hoping to find some hidden value to fund the cleanup. Benjamin spent 3 days digging through the first floor. "I'm sorry, Miss Harrington," Benjamin said, wiping sweat and dust from his forehead. "There's nothing here. It's exactly what it looks like, junk. The furniture is rotted, the typewriters are rusted beyond repair, and these books are just water-damaged encyclopedias. It's going to cost you more to haul this away than the land itself is worth." The family group chat, which she had accidentally been left in, pinged constantly with jokes at her expense. Gregory had posted a photo of his new Porsche with the caption, "My inheritance goes 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. Rachel's inheritance is a fire hazard." Tears of frustration prickled her eyes as she sat on a torn velvet armchair in the parlor, covered in soot and spiderwebs. Why had Arthur done this to her? They had spent hours together drinking tea, talking about history, architecture, and art. He had always told her she had a sharp eye for the unseen. Was it all a delusion? Had he truly just lost his mind and left her the physical burden of his madness? Determined not to let Beatrice and Gregory have the satisfaction of seeing her quit, Rachel rolled up her sleeves and rented a commercial dumpster. If she had to clear out 1,000 broken clocks to prove she wasn't a joke, she would do it. She started with the ground floor, bagging up decades of rot. It was back-breaking, soul-crushing work, but as she moved deeper into the house, clearing the dining room and the kitchen, she began to notice something strange. The chaos wasn't completely random. The stacks of newspapers in the kitchen, while seemingly haphazard, were all dated between 1982 and 1984, specifically focusing on articles about European bank collapses and art heists. The broken clocks in the living room were all stopped at the exact same time, 3:14. Arthur Harrington was a man of meticulous precision. He didn't do anything by accident. The realization hit Rachel like a physical blow. This wasn't a hoarder's nest. It was camouflage. By the 6th week, the first floor was entirely gutted. The dumpster outside had been emptied and refilled 4 times. Rachel was exhausted, her hands calloused and her muscles aching, but a burning curiosity had replaced her initial despair. She moved her operation to the basement. The door to the cellar was located under the main staircase, locked with 3 heavy brass padlocks. It took an angle grinder to get them off. When she finally swung the door open, a rush of cold, terrifyingly dry air greeted her. It didn't smell like a damp Pennsylvania cellar. It smelled sterile. Flicking on a heavy-duty flashlight, she descended the creaking wooden stairs. The basement was massive, stretching the entire length of the house, but like the upstairs, it was packed to the ceiling. However, the items down here were different. It wasn't newspapers and broken clocks. It was heavy machinery, rusted engine blocks, massive iron pipes, and stacks of decaying lumber tightly packed against the far western wall. While taking a break to drink from her water bottle, Rachel sat on an overturned crate and sifted through a metal lockbox she had found earlier in the kitchen. Inside were the original 1895 blueprints of the Willow Creek house. She unfolded the fragile, blue-tinted paper, shining her flashlight over the architectural lines. She traced the foundation parameters, comparing the drawn dimensions to the physical space around her. Rachel frowned. She stood up and paced the length of the basement from the eastern staircase to the western wall of stacked lumber. She counted her steps. 30 feet. She looked down at the blueprint. The basement was supposed to be 45 feet long. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. She looked at the wall of heavy, rotting lumber. It was packed so tightly it looked like a structural support. But according to the blueprint, the house extended another 15 feet past it. She grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from her toolkit. It took her 3 hours of grueling, splintering work to pull away the heavy timber. Her hands bled through her gloves and the dust coated her lungs, but she couldn't stop. As the last massive oak beam crashed to the floor, Rachel stepped back, shining her light on what had been hidden behind it. It wasn't a dirt wall. It wasn't the stone foundation of the house. It was a wall of pristine, modern-poured concrete, and right in the center of it was a massive, brushed steel door. It looked like the entrance to a bank vault. It had no handle, no keyhole, and no hinges. Embedded into the steel beside the door was a sleek, black digital keypad equipped with a biometric fingerprint scanner. It was entirely out of place in the 1800s Victorian ruin. It was state-of-the-art, military-grade security. Rachel dropped the crowbar. The heavy clatter echoed in the silent basement. "What on earth were you hiding, Grandpa?" She approached the door slowly, almost afraid it would alarm. She reached out and touched the black keypad. The moment her skin made contact, the screen blinked to life, casting a cold blue glow over her face. The word "Enter" passcode appeared in crisp digital letters. She didn't have a passcode. She didn't have Arthur's fingerprints. Panic flared in her chest. She had uncovered the secret, but she was locked out. Rachel slumped against the cold steel door, sliding down to sit on the dusty floor. She closed her eyes, forcing her mind to race back through the past 6 weeks, through the thousands of pieces of junk she had sorted. Arthur didn't leave things to chance. He had left her the house. He knew she would find the door. He must have left her a way in. Clocks. She remembered the living room. Over 30 broken grandfather and mantel clocks, all stopped at exactly 3:14. Rachel scrambled to her feet. Her hands were shaking as she tapped the numbers into the keypad. 0314. A harsh red light flashed. Access denied. She swore under her breath. What else? What was she missing? She thought about the bizarre taxidermy, the rusted bird cages, the newspapers. Then she remembered the last conversation she had with Arthur in the hospital. He was weak, barely able to speak, but he had grabbed her hand with surprising strength. "Rachel," he had rasped, his eyes wide and urgent. "Suftruth isn't in the light. It's in the margins. Read the margins of my favorite story." She had thought it was the morphine talking. His favorite story. Arthur was a fanatic for classic literature. He had a massive library in the Chicago estate, which had been liquidated by Beatrice the moment he died. But Arthur had kept a single book on his bedside table for as long as Rachel could remember, a battered first-edition copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. Where was that book? It hadn't been in the hospital room when he died. It wasn't at the reading of the will. Rachel sprinted up the basement stairs, her legs burning. She tore through the house, heading straight for the master bedroom on the 2nd floor. It was the one room she hadn't completely gutted yet. It was filled with old cardboard boxes of clothing and books. She ripped open box after box, tossing aside moldy suits and waterlogged novels. Come on. At the bottom of the 4th box, wrapped tightly in oilcloth, she felt a heavy, rectangular shape. She pulled it out and unwrapped the cloth. There it was. The faded leather-bound copy of Dumas' masterpiece. Rachel opened the book carefully, the spine cracking. She flipped through the pages, looking at the margins. Nothing, just blank, yellowed paper. She flipped to the back, to the front, feeling a rising sense of hysterical defeat. Then she looked closely at the inside of the back cover. Written in faint, almost invisible pencil lead, in Arthur's distinct, looping handwriting, was a string of numbers. 498127. Underneath the numbers, written in bold, heavily pressed ink, was a single sentence. "Burn this house down when you are finished." Rachel stared at the words, a cold shiver racing down her spine. The old man wasn't just eccentric, he was terrified of something. Clutching the book to her chest, she ran back down to the basement. The blue light of the keypad was still glowing in the gloom. She took a deep breath, a finger hovering over the digital numbers. She typed it in. 498127. The keypad beeped. The screen flashed a brilliant, solid green. Passcode ACC appended. Deep within the concrete wall, massive mechanical tumblers began to click and grind. The sound was deafening, the heavy thud of steel bolts retracting echoing through the cellar. With a sharp hiss of depressurized air, the seamless steel door popped open an inch. Rachel grabbed the edge of the heavy door and pulled. It glided open silently on hidden, perfectly oiled hinges. She raised her flashlight and stepped over the threshold into the dark. As her foot hit the floor inside, motion sensors triggered. A grid of brilliant, pure white LED lights snapped on, illuminating the secret room in blinding clarity. Rachel dropped her flashlight. It rolled across the polished epoxy floor, but she didn't even notice. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. She just stared at the walls of the vault, her mind entirely failing to comprehend what she was looking at. The family had laughed at her inheritance. They had called it a junk pit. If only they knew that the junk was just the front door to a billion-dollar empire built on secrets that could send every single one of them to federal prison. The air inside the vault was entirely different from the rest of the decaying Pennsylvania mansion. It was heavily filtered, climate-controlled, and hummed with the quiet, expensive sound of industrial dehumidifiers. Rachel stood paralyzed in the doorway, her eyes struggling to process the sheer magnitude of what her grandfather had buried beneath a mountain of garbage. The room was larger than the footprint of the house above it, suggesting it had been excavated deeply into the surrounding property lines. It was laid out less like a storage unit and more like a high-security museum archive. To her immediate left, bathed in the glow of track lighting, were 6 massive custom-built shelving units lined with uniform, sealed titanium cases. Rachel approached the nearest one with trembling fingers and unclasped the heavy latches. Inside, resting on molded velvet, were rows of pure, unmarked gold bullion. There had to be hundreds of pounds of it in this case alone. But the gold was the least shocking thing in the room. Moving further into the vault, Rachel found a series of climate-sealed, UV-protected glass display cases. She had studied art history extensively in college. It was the very passion that had originally bonded her with Arthur. As she looked at the first painting hanging suspended in the glass, all the breath left her lungs. It was a seascape, violently dramatic, depicting a fragile boat being tossed on dark, terrifying waves. "My God," Rachel whispered to the empty room. It was Rembrandt's Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee. The painting had been famously stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston in 1990, the largest unsold art heist in modern history. The empty frame still hung in the museum. Yet here it was, perfectly preserved in her grandfather's basement. Beside it hung Johannes Vermeer's The Concert, another casualty of the same notorious heist. On a pedestal in the center of the room sat a solid gold, diamond-encrusted Fabergé egg, the lost Alexander III commemorative egg, missing since the Russian Revolution. Arthur Harrington hadn't been a senile old man hoarding broken typewriters. He had been one of the most prolific, untouchable black market shadow brokers on the eastern seaboard. The shipping empire was a front. In the very back of the vault sat a simple, polished mahogany desk. On top of it rested a modern laptop, a satellite phone, and a thick, leather-bound ledger. Next to the ledger was a sealed white envelope with a single word written on it in Arthur's elegant script, Rachel. She sat in the leather chair, her hands shaking violently as she tore open the envelope. The letter inside was dated only 2 months before his death. "My dearest Rachel, if you are reading this, it means you possessed the one trait the rest of our wretched bloodline lacks: perseverance. You didn't run from the dirt. You dug through it. I'm not a good man, Rachel. The Harrington shipping empire was built on a foundation of legitimate freight, but for the last 40 years its true lifeblood has been moving the unmovable. Cartel cash, stolen antiquities, blood diamonds from Sierra Leone, and illicit assets for oligarchs trying to bypass federal sanctions. I use my shipping containers with false bulkheads to move ghosts across the ocean. The wealth I left to your Aunt Beatrice, your Uncle Richard, and your insufferable cousin Gregory is poisoned. Every cent of the Hamptons estate, the Manhattan penthouse, and the trust funds was filtered through offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Swiss accounts with Credit Suisse and UBS. It is blood money, tied directly to the illegal logistics network detailed in the ledger before you. I knew I was dying, and the guilt of what I built finally outweighed the thrill of the game. I could not, however, bring myself to destroy the empire while I was alive. I was too much of a coward. I left you Willow Creek because you are the only innocent Harrington. You never asked me for a dime. You only ever asked for my time. The rest of them are vultures who deserve the cage that is coming for them. The ledger contains every routing number, every hidden account, every corrupt customs official on our payroll, and the exact paper trail linking Richard, Beatrice, and Gregory to the laundering operations. The house above you was designed to deter thieves and family members alike. Nobody looks for $1 billion vault under a fire hazard of rotting newspapers. I leave the choice to you. Walk away or burn the empire to the ground. Love, Arthur. Rachel stared at the letter, her pulse roaring in her ears. Her Uncle Richard's mocking voice echoed in her mind. I suppose you can open museum for broken toasters. She opened the heavy leather ledger. It was a masterpiece of illicit accounting. There were columns linking Gregory's supposedly untouchable trust fund directly to a wire transfer from a known international arms dealer in 2018. Beatrice knew Hampton's estate was purchased using a shell company that was currently under investigation by Interpol for smuggling conflict minerals. If this ledger saw the light of day, the Harrington family wouldn't just lose their inheritance. They would lose their freedom. The federal government would seize everything under the RICO Act. The yachts, the penthouses, the sports cars, it would all be frozen, confiscated, and dismantled. Rachel reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. She opened the camera app and began photographing every single page of the ledger, every bank account number, every illicit transfer. She took wide shots of the stolen artwork and the pallets of gold. She was halfway through photographing the banking documents when a heavy, muffled sound echoed from the ceiling above. Footsteps. Heavy, hurried footsteps walking across the floorboards of the first level. Rachel froze. The front door had been locked. Rachel, our voice bellowed from the top of the basement stairs. The sheer aggression in the tone made her blood run cold. It was Uncle Richard. I know you're down here, you little rat. Another voice yelled, Gregory! Panic seized her. She quickly shoved the ledger into her backpack, zipped it tight, and grabbed the letter. She stood up, knocking the mahogany chair backward. The bank just froze my accounts, Rachel. Gregory's voice echoed down the wooden stairs, growing louder as they descended into the junk-filled basement. Federal agents raided Dad's office in Manhattan 3 hours ago looking for a master ledger. What did the old man give you? They hadn't come to check on her. The federal authorities had already started following the breadcrumbs Arthur had purposely left exposed before his death. The FBI was squeezing them, and Richard, being no fool, realized that the only piece of the puzzle missing was the junk house his father had so adamantly protected. Rachel sprinted out of the vault, her boots hitting the epoxy floor. She crossed the threshold, stepping back into the dusty, dingy basement just as the beams of 2 heavy flashlights swung around the corner of the staircase. There she is. Gregory's voice shattered the basement's silence. He scrambled over a pile of rusted pipes, his designer suit catching on jagged metal. Uncle Richard followed, leaning heavily on his silver-tipped cane, his face flushed with panic and rage. "You deceitful little—" Richard froze. His flashlight beam swept past Rachel and locked onto the pristine concrete wall and the open, brushed steel vault door. The sterile LED lights from within spilled into the dingy cellar, gleaming off titanium cases of gold and the edges of priceless framed masterpieces. Gregory dropped his flashlight. "What? What is this?" "This," Rachel said, stepping backward until her shoulders brushed the cold steel of the vault door, "is the real inheritance." Richard's eyes bulged with a frantic, desperate greed. He shoved his son aside. "Move, Rachel. The feds raided my Manhattan office 3 hours ago. They froze our accounts. If the master ledger is in there, I need it. Now, we can liquidate the gold tonight and disappear." "It's too late, Uncle Richard," Rachel said, gripping her backpack tight. "Don't lie to me," Richard snarled, raising his cane. "Give me the books." "I said it's too late," Rachel repeated, pulling her cracked phone from her pocket. "I've been down here for hours. I photographed every single page of that ledger, every offshore account, every bribe. 10 minutes ago, I uploaded the file to a secure server. If I don't cancel it, it automatically emails the FBI art crime team and Interpol." Richard's face drained of color. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't destroy your own family." "You aren't my family," Rachel replied, her voice ice cold. "You're the people who laughed at me while sitting on a throne of blood money. Arthur wanted this empire dismantled. I'm just finishing the job." Gregory lunged. "Get her phone." Rachel reacted instantly. She slammed her hand against the heavy emergency close button on the vault's inner frame. The massive steel slab sprang to life, gliding shut with terrifying pneumatic force. She threw herself backward out of the vault, landing hard on the dusty floor just as the door sealed shut with a deafening boom. The keypad flashed red. The vault, the art, and the physical ledger were locked away in an impenetrable, fireproof bunker, but Rachel was now trapped on the outside with them. Richard swung his cane in a blind rage. The silver tip caught Rachel's shoulder, sending her crashing into a towering stack of 1982 newspapers. Pain flared down her arm. "You stupid girl!" Richard screamed. "The cartel will kill us all." "Open that door." Rachel scrambled backward, her hand brushing against her brass Zippo lighter, which had fallen from her pocket. "Burn this house down when you are finished." Arthur's final instruction wasn't about destroying the vault. It was about destroying the camouflage. She flicked the lighter open. The small flame illuminated the dry, brittle mountains of paper surrounding them. "Don't take another step," Rachel warned. Gregory threw his hands up. "Rachel, wait! The whole house is a tinderbox." Exactly," she said, and tossed the lighter into the canyon of paper. The ignition was explosive. The decades-old, dry-rotted newspapers went up with a violent roar, a wall of blistering orange flame erupting between Rachel and her uncle. "Fire! Let's go!" Gregory shrieked. He abandoned his father, scrambling up the basement stairs on all fours as thick, black smoke rapidly filled the space. Richard stared at the flames, coughing violently as he realized his empire was literally turning to ash. "You ruined us," he screamed before turning and fleeing after his son. Covering her mouth with her jacket, Rachel sprinted toward a small ground-level storm window. She kicked the rusted frame out with her boot and hoisted herself up, tumbling out onto the wet, overgrown grass just as the smoke alarms began to scream. She scrambled away from the foundation and watched the flames devour the rotting Victorian structure. Sirens wailed in the distance. Rachel looked down at her cracked phone, opened her email draft, and hit send. The fallout was swift and absolute. By the time the fire was extinguished, the FBI was already setting up an excavation perimeter. The discovery of the pristine vault and the recovery of Rembrandt's stolen seascape made global headlines. Uncle Richard was arrested at Teterboro Airport, attempting to flee the country. Beatrice was escorted from her Hamptons estate in handcuffs. Gregory's trust funds were seized, leaving him bankrupt and facing federal charges. They had mocked Rachel for inheriting a house full of garbage. But as she stood on the balcony of her new flat in Florence, Italy, sipping espresso, she smiled. Between the whistleblower rewards and the massive insurance finder's fees for the recovered art, she had built a legitimate fortune of her own. Arthur was right. The truth was buried in the dirt, and Rachel was the only one willing to dig. If you were on the edge of your seat during Rachel's incredible discovery, don't keep this story hidden in the vault. Like this video, share it with your friends to see who would have survived the basement, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable twist-filled true stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss out on the next hidden treasure.